Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our virtual lecture program tonight. My name is Leslie Thompson. I am Director of Adult Programs at the Sid Richardson Museum. And before we get into our program, I want to start first with a land acknowledgement, which pays tribute to the original inhabitants of the land that we're on. So we, the Sid Richardson Museum, respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. And the Sid would especially like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes upon whose historical homeland our museum is located. So the subject of tonight's lecture program is inspired by our current exhibit entitled In a Different Light, Winslow, Homer, and Frederic Remington. And although the Sid Richardson Museum galleries are temporarily closed to on-site visitors, we'd like to invite you to experience the exhibit along with the rest of our collection with a 360-degree virtual tour that's available on our website. And if you look at your chat box, I have left a link to that as well, so you can take a look at that at your leisure. Now, this exhibit pairs these two iconic American artists. You've got Winslow, Homer, and Frederic Remington. And although Homer is known for his seaside paintings and Remington is known for his imagery of the American West, many similarities can be found in their art and artistic careers. And as our guest speaker will argue tonight, as visual artists, Homer and Remington were in many respects like cousins. Now, before I introduce our guest speaker, I want to bring your attention to a couple of Zoom features. As I mentioned, there is a chat box feature in which you can see the link to our virtual tour, as I mentioned, but also Dr. Griffin has a couple of questions that he'd like to pose to you during his presentation. And during those times, the chat box is where you can type your responses to share with him. Then another feature I want to bring your attention to is the Q&A box, which is separate from the chat box. So if at any point during the talk you have a question, I'd like to encourage you to please type your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box. Please put your questions in the Q&A box so that we can collect them all in one place. So Dr. Griffin can answer those at the end of his presentation. And a really nice feature from the Q&A box is that if you see a question that someone's already asked and you like it, you can upvote it or you can give it a like, and it will bump that question up to the top so that we're sure to see it when we get to the Q&A portion of our program tonight. So having set all of that up, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to our speaker tonight, Dr. Randall Griffin. Dr. Griffin is a University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Art History at Southern Methodist University. After receiving a PhD in art history from the University of Delaware, he was a Wyeth Predoctoral Fellow for 2 years at the National Gallery of Art Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, and then taught at Vanderbilt University before coming to SMU in 1993. He has authored several articles as well as 4 books, including his book, Winslow, Homer, An American Vision, which won the Dallas Museum of Art's Vasari Prize in 2008. And Dr. Griffin is currently at work on a book about the late work of Georgia O'Keeffe. And we are honored to have him with us tonight to look at the conversation between these two great American artists, Winslow Homer and Frederic Remington. So with that, Dr. Griffin, I will go ahead and mute my mic and I will pass it off to you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you so much for inviting me. And this is really what I'm trying to do is give you a classroom lecture. So I will be asking questions, but I want to begin with just some introductory comments, some larger points, and also a brief chronology. I realize that many of you are knowledgeable about Remington and Homer, but just as a review. So the similarities between the two, both were realists, and we can talk about the word realism later, who began as illustrators. Neither had much formal art training. Both were considered all-American realists. and both portray open narratives. The differences: Homer began his career about 20 years before Remington. They picture different subjects. Homer depicted nature, sea themes, hunting and fishing. And Remington, of course, portrayed cowboys, Native Americans, the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, and also late in life New York landscapes. Remington depicted scenes of combat and contested territory also. And just a point to underscore, Homer rarely shows figures in motion. There are some notable exceptions. And he includes, he also does not include, as in general, as many props as Remington did. As far as chronologies, very briefly, as far as Homer, he's born in Boston. His father was a hardware store businessman who had a terrible business career and was a kind of dreamer, went to the gold rush in 1849 out west and lost family money and that sort of thing. Homer had no university education. His brother went to Harvard University and became a chemist and a very successful businessman. He does not marry. And he's an illustrator for 20 years between 1855 and 1875, lives in New York during that time. In 1863, he takes some classes at the National Academy of Design, that's in New York, the major art school in New York and the oldest in the country. In 1862 to 66, he has oil paintings of the Civil War that were exhibited at the National Academy of Design. This is when he begins as a painter. In 1867, he visits Paris for 9 months. He doesn't take art classes there. He's working as an illustrator, but he also does oils, and he also is exposed to new art in Paris. In 1881, he spends nearly 2 years in Cullercoats, England, on the North Sea, in northern England, in a fishing village, art colony there. And that really changes his art and has a real effect on his art for the rest of his career. And then in 1883, he settles in Maine. So that's on the coast of Maine, just in southern Maine, very rocky coast with great very, very cold weather, as you can imagine, in Maine. From 1886 to 1899, he does sea disaster paintings. And then in this period, he's also traveling to the Adirondacks in upstate New York, to Canada, to Florida, the Bahamas. And then 1890 begins Seascapes, and he dies in 1910. As far as Remington, he's born in Canton, New York. His father was an Army officer in the Civil War and also a newspaper editor. The family absolutely adored horses and had horses. Of course, Remington himself did. Also attended Yale Art School. And then in 1881, he traveled to Montana and sees a vanishing American West. And 1881, the same year, he does his first illustrations, which were published in the major middle-class journal of that day, Harper's Weekly. In 1884, he's in Kansas, is a partial owner of a saloon and a sheep farm in Kansas. Those were both generally disastrous business investments. In 1885, takes classes at the Art Students League in New York. And those are really the only classes he takes as art classes. 1886, he's already established himself by the mid 80s as a major illustrator. And then in 1886, Harper's Weekly sends him to Arizona and he begins collecting artifacts. We can see in his studio outside of New York, this very lavish studio that he builds around 1900, that he has a huge collection of Western gear from cowboys and various Native American tribes. In 1887, he's commissioned to supply 83 illustrations for Roosevelt's, a good friend of his, Theodore Roosevelt's Ranch Life and the Hunting Trail. And then in 1889, he paints his first major work, which is owned by the Amon Carter, A Dash for the Timber, this was his first, it was commissioned, first large picture. In 1890, he has his first gallery exhibition of paintings. Of course, he's an ambitious artist, starting in really, especially in the late 80s and into the 90s. 1890, he moves to New Rochelle, New York with his wife, and they build this lavish house and studio and takes many trips out west, virtually every year. In 1895, he begins his series of bronzes, does about 20 of these. The Bronco Buster is the first one. And those are sold mainly through Tiffany, by the way, in New York. In 1895, he illustrates Owen Wister, his very good friend, who's a novelist and writes for many of the journals, The Evolution of the Cowpuncher, which is a major article that really creates the myth of the cowboy as we know it. That's in 1895. And then 1898, the Spanish Civil War in Cuba. He does a series of illustrations and paintings. And then 1908, the year before he dies, he burns lots of his paintings and is influenced by Impressionism and the night scenes of Whistler. And in that last decade is doing a lot of those paintings. Okay, so I want to begin with their first major work. So, and we can see from the dates that they're about 20 years apart, their career. These are the first paintings that really gave them publicity. And this is obviously at the Amon Carter, A Dash for the Timber, and then The Prisoners from the Front from 1866, and a Civil War painting. So, and these were both, this was a commissioned painting. This was not a commissioned painting. It was bought by John Johnston, a major businessman. And okay, so I just want to mention very quickly this point. And this is a nice comparison between them with Snap the Whip by Homer from 1872, one of two versions of this painting, and A Dash for the Timber. They're both realists, and by that I don't mean that their paintings are always factual. They're almost all done in the studio, with the exception of plein air drawings, outdoor drawings, watercolors by them. So the paintings, the oil paintings, are almost all done in the studio, and they're largely imagined scenes based on pencil drawings or watercolors or small oil sketches. Rather, what I mean by realists is that they both sought the illusion of veracity. They're trying to create things that seem very real, founded in the empirical, founded in reality. And they were also both seen as penultimate, quintessential realists, as true to nature, true to the eye, true to facts. And of course, Remington's art was seen as very historically accurate. They're selective scenes. Again, they're done in New York. They're incredible works of imagination, but they're also based on things that he had either seen or interviews with people he met out west, and also the gear that he collected from people out west or from on his own trips. So do you see, and the first question to ask is, do you see any differences in the children in this group? And if we think about this group of boys, this is Snap the Whip by Homer from 1872, based on a trip in 1870 to upstate New York he had taken to visit a one-room schoolhouse. And the other boys, do you see any difference between these boys and these boys?
This is a question that Dr. Griffin is actually posing to y'all, our audience. So if you would, if you do see any differences, put them in the chat box feature and we can share those. We'll give you a couple of seconds to respond. Someone is saying ties on the boys in front.
Okay.
Someone is saying shoes versus no shoes.
Absolutely. Yes, they got it. That's great. So
there's also the boys on the left appear to be older. And then, yeah, lots of references to shoes.
Okay. So why would the boys here, who are, by the way, following, obviously, have shoes on? What does that denote about them versus all of these boys without shoes? Again, they seem to be weaker. They have fallen first, right? So why would they be wearing shoes? Where did they come from versus all of the boys in the foreground here?
Some people are, we got a response, socioeconomic. Someone is saying city boys, town versus country.
Absolutely. Town versus country, not so much class here. So this, the reason I'm using this as an illustration, it's a fairly rare example of Homer showing figures in motion, which is very much like Remington. But Homer was interested in exploring different social aspects of America. And in this case, it's one of a whole series of paintings and also illustrations he did about schools in America, rural schools in America. Some of them focus, as we'll see, on the teachers. Others focus on the students in the case of this. Others put the schools in context. So the one-room schoolhouse, as we know from myth, really is born in America before the Civil War, and they really flourish by this period. By the 1870s, they're ubiquitous. There are thousands of these in rural America, one-room schoolhouses, right? And it's this push for literacy in America that we see. The Carnegie libraries are given, whatever, in the 1890s, I think, 1880s, and that's part of that. So there's this push for literacy. The teachers before the Civil War would have been mainly men, but there were 700,000 who died during the war, and then many were wounded. So you start seeing many more women teachers in America after the Civil War. Okay, so this is an example, again, of his analyzing, elucidating the division between the town boys who are raised in the town and those who are raised on the farm. And of course, in rural America, most people still, you know, in 1870, 2/3 of Americans were on farms still. You don't have the combines, you don't have the mechanized, you know, the machinery. By 1900, you didn't need a family of 10 kids or 8 kids. You only needed 2 or 3. Everything starts shifting. People moved to cities by 1900. It's you know, fewer than half of the Americans are on farms. But at this time, there's still a lot of people on farms. They need a lot of kids. And so these are farm kids. Again, okay. Here we see the detail of the kids, one of the kids who's fallen. Now, what about with the Remington? What is happening in this scene? And obviously, there are Native Americans chasing these cowboys here in the foreground. And that you can see on the left, there's a line of trees. They're trying desperately to reach the trees before they're killed. So, so that's why it's called a dash for the timber. But if you look at the line of figures, some of them shooting back, right? But what's going on in this scene?
And so here's another question that Dr. Griffin is posing to y'all. What are you seeing in this scene? Particularly the front of the scene. What are you noticing? And you can put those answers in the chat box as well. Seeing a different class. One is wounded. One man shot and his friends trying to help.
Yes, and that is really key here. So his idea of masculinity and ideas of masculinity generally in that day would be skill and courage. Think of sporting contests and military, battles, but this is a version of that. So the writings of Teddy Roosevelt, The Cult of Masculinity in this day, but here his buddy is protecting him. So you have a sense, it's an image of courage, skill, and chivalry. And that's very important, this kind of altruism in battle that Remington shows, right? The cowboy is in many ways, even though he's a free-ranging spirit, there's a the cowboy in many ways is good morally. He may visit prostitutes and gets drunk and do things like that, but he also has a real sense of courage and goodness about him in this way. Okay, so I wanted to show you, if we look at the source for the for Snap the Whip by Homer, what Homer was looking to was Eastman Johnson's The Old Stage Coach, which had been exhibited at the National Academy of Design in New York the year before. And it's an image of, children playing outdoors. It has that natural sense of light and exuberance. Homer's feels much more Baroque and dynamic, but nonetheless, Johnson was one of the most respected painters in the country and one of the most successful painters at that time, an older painter by a couple of decades, someone who had been to Europe and studied there, was esteemed. So if Homer is looking to Johnson as a model, what Remington is looking to, as a lot of you already know, is French battle scenes by people, and he would have known these from reproductive engravings. This was actually owned by the Metropolitan Museum. It's an it opened in 1870, and it's one of the first paintings that they acquired. It's by Meissonier. It's this Friedland battle, which shows one of Napoleon's famous victories. And again, all of these figures in motion, and based on photographs of horses in motion, this kind of detailed realism or naturalism by Meissonier. Remington knew others, but this is a good kind of example. And so that's the ultimate source that, along with his eye and the studies that he did of horses and riders, that really inspired him. Another thing to point out is that Remington often depicts contested terrain, battles of this sort, and also the scenes often lack a sense of closure. We don't know exactly what will happen here, which is one of the things that's really appealing about Remington's work. The first illustrations Homer does, he starts in 1855, but he's really becomes very well known as an illustrator during the Civil War. And the first illustrations are very much like what Remington would do later. Scenes of battle with figures on horses, masses of figures, but very quickly, that same year, he stops doing figures in motion. And this is one work that a lot of historians look to as a kind of prefiguration of his mature style, which is a figure isolated and absolutely still. It shows one of the sharpshooters, and they were, strong. They're really hated by the army because they could pick someone off at a half a mile without their awareness. And the canteen alludes to what they would often do, which is at night, someone, from the Confederates or the Union forces, they need water, and they would sneak out and bring a bunch of canteens to fill them with water and then get shot. So the public saw sharpshooters actually in a completely different light as heroes. They were often isolated and in danger, alone. And many of them died because of that, but people in the army saw them as ungentlemanly. in that day. So this is one of Homer's great Civil War paintings. It's The Veteran in a New Field from 1865. And what we know is that Homer originally had painted this. This was painted in the summer and fall of 1865 after the end of the war. And he had originally painted it with multi-bladed scythe. And that was the most up-to-date form of scythe, but he changed it. And we think the reason he changed it is because he was alluding to this. He was alluding, we can see a detail here, he was alluding to images of death cutting down men in battle. And so if you think of what happens at the end of the war with close to a million men coming home, the disruptions, a lot of the men were addicted to opium. There was terrible spousal abuse. The asylums opened in all of the states because of the veterans. Many of them had terrible psychological aftermath of the war, after the war. And so this is an image of normalcy. But it says new field because there's no way for this man to actually return to his old field, what he was before the war. So he's returned to that normalcy, but it also alludes to the violence and death of war, the scene. And we see that this is another concern of Homer's. We see that he shows the empty sleeve at Newport, our watering places. This is a couple, married couple, a place that they had visited before the war in Newport, but now, of course, the woman is driving the carriage, which is something that is transgressive, and the man is a shadow of what he was before. Homer is very interested in exploring different sides of American society, looking at the effects of the war, for instance. This was shown at the 1867 World's Fair in Paris, and that's what prompted Homer to go to Paris for 9 months. This is owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art today. And it shows his good friend, General Barlow, who was a very young man, a great hero in the war and celebrated for his military accomplishments, and then a group of Southerners, 2 country yokels, and then a man who really embodies the Old South itself, a kind of failed aristocracy. And then this was one of Homer's illustrations he did when he was in Paris, showing artists doing copies at the Louvre. And we have this young proper woman and then this bohemian figure in the background. It's sort of funny pairing there. And then when he comes back, he does paintings like this. And this is the White Mountains from 1868. And it has this extraordinary sense of light, a daylight about it that he captures. It's done in his New York studio, but it's based on outdoor or plein air sketches that he did. And so if we think of this and we compare it with Claude Monet from the same period, 1868, the question that naturally arises is whether Homer, when he was in Paris in 1867, was aware of Impressionism. And the answer is absolutely not. The Impressionists first had their exhibition in 1874. The Franco-Prussian War was in 1870-71, and that sort of interrupted things for the Impressionists, so they delayed it a number of years. And he would not have known Monet's work at this time. He wasn't showing in the Salon. Actually, Homer was probably thinking of outdoor painting from other sources. And this is a good example. This is Eastman Johnson from 1874. Again, Johnson was a very esteemed painter, well known, and had been doing these plein air informed paintings, this wonderful sense of light, since the 1860s. So Homer is probably thinking of people like Eastman Johnson. Homer, this is the kind of painting that he saw in Paris that really impressed him. This is one of many peasant painters in that day, and there were dozens and dozens. Peasant painting was the most popular kind of art, along with landscape painting in France at that time. And this is by Jules Breton, who, along with people like Millet and dozens of others, he was a very prominent peasant painter. These kind of monumental figures of farm workers very much impressed Homer. This is one of Homer's paintings on the right from 1876, The Song of the Lark. And you can see how he has emulated this kind of sensibility of the monumentalizing peasant, these sort of timeless images of farm workers. He's also thinking of plein air sketches. This is by Corot. It's at the Kimball Museum in Fort Worth, a marvelous Corot of Italy from 1827, a very small outdoor oil sketch that Corot did, but many people did the same thing in America. So this is Homer in 1870, and Homer and lots of people are doing these outdoor oil sketches by the 1850s. And Homer would have known this from the National Academy of Design, where he took classes. There were exhibits for artists of oil sketches. So Homer is using, again, an umbrella to keep the light even, and an easel. This is the exact same equipment that Corot would have been using in the 1830s and 1820s in Italy, or even going back to the late 18th century. What made this possible is this: metal tubes of paint. So this is Winslow and Newton, the British firm, and it's patented in 1841. This is what Renoir, the Impressionist, says: without paint in tubes, there would have been nothing, or what the journalists were later to call Impressionists. So before, you had pig's bladders that would easily split, that were used to hold the paint when you went outdoor and did like the Corot here. This was done with an animal bladder, but the oil, yes, here we go. Yeah, these come in 1841. So this is what Homer would have been used and others. Okay, so in paint, the other thing that changes is all kinds of artificial colors come in the 19th century. So the point I'm trying to make is, when you look at painting, and this is by Gérôme, the great Orientalist and realist, Tiger on the Watch, which is at MFA Houston from 1888, artists of all kinds were expected to be able to render appearance in natural light. So Homer, not just the Impressionists, but all Remington, other artists. This is a Remington from 1902, and it has a natural sense of light about it. These could have been done plein air. That's how they look. So that was an expectation because of plein air painting, because of the ubiquity of it, because of virtually, all painters practiced plein air painting by the 1850s and 1860s. This is Homer. He also does lots of scenes of middle-class leisure. This is at the Art Institute, his great croquet painting, but it's one of a series of paintings he did after the Civil War, this one from 1866. And he also does things like this seascape, this image of Long Branch with these women in their fashionable dresses in the wind. And this is a place for bathing, where people would change clothes. He had an interest in fashion and class that's explored in his work at the time. He's probably aware of the work of the French painter Boudin, who does lots of seascapes, and he would have known the work from his time in Paris. Also, I just wanted to show you this marvelous painting called The Dinner Horn from 1870, which is a Paul Mellon gift to the National Gallery in the 1990s, the National Gallery in Washington. If you look at this scrim of trees, it really looks like a Monet from that period. It has that feeling of being plein air with this wonderful blasting light. And this farm woman is calling the workers in the background, you see a haystack, to come in for a dinner. And I want to use it to illuminate something that's very important for our discussion here. So this is Henry James before he moves to England, becomes the famous novelist that we know. He had been in Europe for 2 years, in France and Italy, and was quite cosmopolitan. And he started writing art reviews when he came back to America in 1875. And this is a very derisive review of Homer, and we think he's one of the icons of American art today. But this shows you the kind of bias against American art that existed then. Before Mr. Homer's little barefoot urchins and little girls in calico sunbonnets straddling beneath a cloudless sky upon the National Rail fence, the whole effort of the critic is instinctively to contract himself, to double himself up. Mr. Homer goes in, as the phrase is, for perfect realism, and cares not a jot for such fantastic hair splitting as the distinction between beauty and ugliness. We frankly confess that we detest his subjects, his barren plank fences, his glaring bald blue skies, his big, dreary, vacant lots of meadows, his freckled, straight-haired Yankee urchins, his flat-breasted maidens, suggestive of a dish of rural donuts and pie. He has chosen the least pictorial features of the least pictorial range of scenery and civilization. He has resolutely treated them as if they were pictorial, as if they were every inch as good as Capri or Tangiers. And this shows not only a deep bias against American art and culture, but also against American subject matter itself. And so there's a big backlash and criticism in the American art world in the 1880s, all the way through the early 20th century, against this bias for French art and culture, and Homer and Remington both benefit from that. Okay, and so nothing seemed more American than Homer's images of rural New England, and also Remington's wonderful images of the American West. Remember, before the Civil War, it was mainly landscapes, the Hudson River School. This was considered quintessentially innately American. The scenes of the Rocky Mountains, the scenes of the Adirondacks and the Catskills, the scenes of Yosemite, like this. And all of this changes after the Civil War. Remington and Homer, of course, are mainly figure painters. Okay, so we are running out of time, but who is the woman in the middle here? These are factory women, and they're being called, this is called the morning bell. Here's the bell ringing, and they are about to go to work in this textile mill back here. Who is this woman? And we see behind something that denotes her profession. Who is she, you guys?
So leave your guesses in the chat box, and we'll give you a few seconds. A lot of guesses for a school teacher.
Got it. That's absolutely right. You guys get a gold star. Okay, so if we look, there is a one-room schoolhouse, and we look at her dress with her bonnet and her slightly nicer clothing versus the factory women. How is she treated by them, you guys?
What do y'all think? Leave your answers in the chat box.
How are they treating her?
She is shunned. Absolutely.
So these school teachers came from towns and cities. They were literate. Some of them are middle class. These are working class women. And why would these women have not liked this new woman in their community?
What do you
think?
What is she
competing with them for?
She doesn't understand their struggles.
Okay, well, what is she competing with them for?
She has a better job. She made more money.
Okay.
Educated. She's educated.
Okay, but as far as just any place, what is this pretty girl competing with them. For
A lot of people are saying attention, stature, and men. Lots of men.
Exactly. You guys have got it right. Okay. Yes. So they were known for being alienated and isolated in their community. They came to these areas to teach and had great hardship. And Homer knew that very well. So here's an illustration he did 2 years later, which is a wood engraving of factory workers. He doesn't have the school teacher in this group. And he does this also, this scene of this wonderful scene, which is at the St. Louis Art Museum, the country school. Look at the students and how they're divided, you guys. Look at the students and how they're divided. This group versus this group. How are they divided?
We've got someone that says class, age, clothing by grade, boys on one side.
Yes.
City, country.
So, yeah, so these are the boys. These are the girls over here. I'm very envious, is completely in control of her classroom. Everyone seems to be paying close attention. The only only boy on the right side is this young boy who's crying. And then their lunch pails are in the back. You can see her bell and then flowers here. This is a time when he uses more props in his early work. And I also wanted to show just this wonderful sense of light that reminds me so much of Andrew Wyeth's later work with windows and his incredible watercolors. This is a dry brush watercolor by Wyeth from 1960. Wyeth loved Homer. Okay, and then the teacher in the center. Just to show you, this is a watercolor from this period that really exemplifies Homer's early watercolors. This is from 1877, and you have this almost photographic, very corporeal figure of the teacher, very detailed, and then this utterly abstract flat background with these bands. It's an absolutely amazing painting, watercolor painting. Again, he's interested in social structures. He's interested in a kind of oppressiveness of industrial America. This woman is going to become this woman, young, old. They're trapped in this cycle of poverty, trapped in this factory life. The boys, there are no child labor laws at this time. So you commonly have that. He's also interested in African Americans and during the period of Reconstruction and how they're entrapped also. Again, if we think of Jules Breton, these kind of monumental figures. And also just wanted to show you this image, which again, like the woman at the blackboard, it really typifies his early watercolors from the 1870s, when they're still very tightly drawn. They're really like colored drawings. They're beautiful, but they don't have the kind of looseness that you'll see in his later work. So if we think of Homer's watercolors, and today his watercolors, the best of the watercolors would bring $3 to $5 million. They were sold in their day for $50 or $100. But the other thing that sort of corollary to that would be Remington's bronzes. So Remington doesn't do many watercolors, but he does bronzes, and of course Homer, and he does marvelous bronzes. And Homer doesn't do sculpture. So both of them had that other medium that they worked in. So Homer goes and spends nearly 2 years in on the coast, the North Sea coast in England, in a fishing village, and he does lots of these incredible watercolors, very few oils, and learns the watercolor technique, and also falls in love with these scenes, of these sublime scenes of man and nature in contest with one another, with these storms and things. This is the fog warning from 1885. It's one of Homer's most famous works. And what we see is a man who is working for this sailing ship in the back, and he has heard the fog warning, and he knows that he is probably not going to live, because you could see the rising fog in the background by the time he's steeling himself to row like mad to try to get to that boat, and he knows he probably will not make it. A lot of fishermen died this way because the fog would close in and then they couldn't get back to the mother ship. And it's just an absolutely amazing painting. And it's one, he does lots of these sea disaster paintings in the 80s and the 90s. And we can see that in a way that written down by Remington, which shows a Cheyenne Indian Native American. He's out of arrows, has his war clubs, and he is preparing to die. He's preparing for the battle against these men who are coming up. His horse is completely worn out. Both of these are really about stoicism and preparing for death, and understanding and about being manly outdoors, all of that. They're very similar in that way. Homer also does lots of scenes of the coast of Maine, with some of them with these monumental waves. We can see this man who's a hunter here standing there with these incredible waves. This is very impastoed, thick. The feeling of the rocks and the waves are visceral in these paintings. Another one of these wonderful images, this one at the Metropolitan Museum. He became very famous for his images of waves in the 1890s. He also does scenes like this, which is the Fox Hunt, which is my favorite painting by Winslow Homer. It's at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and it is magnificent. And it's an image which shows a group of crows that seem like personifications of death that will attack the fox and kill the fox. And the fox is set in deep snow. The red berries allude to his death and blood. In point of fact, an ornithologist will tell you that the foxes, the crows are mobbing the fox, so they're trying to drive it away. They're actually not going to kill a predator in that way, but that's how Homer saw it, and that's how people in the day saw it. And we can see an image like the fox hunt as quite similar to Fight for the Water Hole at MFA Houston from 1903 by Remington. They both have this incredible sense of graphic design. They have these open-ended narratives. Their ability to create really an ominous sense. Both of them are terrific in that way, and a great artist in that regard. This is a man who is a local hunter in the Adirondacks. Homer and his brother owned a place. They were members of an elite hunting and fishing club in the Adirondacks for very wealthy people from Boston and New York and Philadelphia. And this is one of the locals. They were guides, but this is a man who's a hunter and someone living a hard scrabble life, doing something, hunting in a way that no one would, no gentleman would have done. These are locals who were guides, and this shows the kind of energy and freshness and life of Homer's late watercolors, where they, the blue boat has a kind of electric energy about it, absolute assurance, absolute economy. He's no longer interested in drawing all of the details. Here's an image of fishing, which is one of these elite, very, very wealthy fishermen, a member of that club. Look at how the fishing pole and the line is done with a simple pencil drawing. This is at the Freer Museum in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian. And it's an incredible painting. Again, watercolor, you can't make mistakes. So he has this amazing ability, technical virtuosity and economy, just amazing what he can do. Some of his are just of pure nature, looking down into an Adirondack pond and seeing all this nature. And then he does all of these scenes starting in the 1880s of the Caribbean and Florida. He was drawn there because of the fishing. He loves fishing. He does many of these watercolors, and he's selling these to fishermen, right? In fishing and hunting sportsmen's magazines, also showing them in New York galleries. And the height and the color of his palette is heightened by his trips to the South, to the Caribbean. He says, "You will see in the future, I will live by my watercolors." He understood how magnificent they were. And you get these, again, they're breathtaking. They look like they were painted yesterday. And they have this kind of raw energy to them. If we think of the other great watercolors from this day, the unbelievable, this painting at the Met, these are from about 1900. This is by John Singer Sargent. It's a scene of Venice with boats. And this is by Homer. Sargent is an absolute master of the medium of watercolor too. But notice with Sargent, there's much more three-dimensional sense of the boats. He is a master draftsman, and Homer is has more freedom about it. Both of them have a kind of virtuosity that's just amazing. Okay, so we're almost to the end now. I just want to point out two major sources for both for Remington especially, but also for Homer. And one of them is Whistler. So Whistler starts doing these night scenes in the early 1870s. They're called nocturnes, and they're very, very abstract and simple. They're based on Japanese art screens and prints that he knew. And he does lots of these things, also etchings. And they have a real influence on Homer with scenes like this sketch called The Sleigh Ride, which is very monochromatic. It's at the Clark Art Institute in Massachusetts. Very, very simple, incredibly abstract. It feels so cold and it feels so distilled, and it's an amazing sense of design. And it really is a plein air sketch. It's done so loosely. And we look at Remington, and Remington was really infatuated with Whistler's night scenes and does many, many paintings after 1900, starting in the late 1890s, that are inspired by Whistler's night scenes, like this wonderful scene. Whistler would never have included action or figures in motion in the way this incredible painting. This is one of your paintings, right, Leslie? Okay, good. Yeah, it's an amazing painting. Or this scene, Figure of the Night from 1908, the Sentinel. Again, he's completely infatuated, much more than Homer with Whistler's night scenes. We're almost finished. It is interesting, again, how he takes that vocabulary from Whistler and makes it his own, very much. This is one of my favorite paintings, Moonlight Wolf from 1909. Which is at, I think, the Addison Gallery. I'm probably wrong about that, or the Wadsworth Athenaeum, I think, from 1909. Absolutely amazing scene. Again, Whistler never would have done this, but I love what Remington does with this. If we think of Impressionism in America, it started here in 1886. When Durand Ruel, the gallery owner in Paris and London, had 300 works shown in a New York gallery, and this was his reaction. The exhibition was successful in that it aroused immense curiosity, and contrary to what had happened in Paris, provoked neither an uproar or stupid remarks, nor raised any protests. It almost sold out. Americans became some of the first great collectors of Impressionism. So 1886, if we had looked at 1874 at the first exhibition, Americans were not aware of it. The last exhibition of Impressionism is this year, 1886. So it's really not until the mid 1880s that Americans are aware of Impressionism widely at all. They had very derisive things to say about it in the late 1870s. They're really not taking it seriously. So everything changes that with this exhibition. And Remington himself becomes infatuated with Impressionism. And he knows American Impressionists. He's seen Impressionist works also in galleries in Europe. This is I think, almost the last painting that I have. And this is one of his marvelous plein air works. And I think, didn't you, Leslie, show this This is this is at the Remington Museum in New York, and it shows really what a full-fledged impressionist Remington became. Much more experimental in that sense than Homer. Here's another one of these that I think you showed also. So in conclusion, they shared many similarities, but also had many differences. Homer's work is more wide-ranging in its subject, including his remarkable watercolors, and less dependent on details and props. But Remington invented the world of a cultural myth, the American West. I mean, it is amazing, that accomplishment alone. If you think of Remington and Owen Wister and what they created with an American West that we know today in movies and novels and stuff, it's an incredible legacy. Very few artists have achieved that. Remington was also more experimental with the vocabulary of Whistler and Impressionism. Okay, thanks. Sorry to have gone over.
No, that's great. Thank you so much, Randall. That was fantastic. I feel like I know so much more about Homer and Remington. So we have some time left, a little bit of time left, and time to answer some questions. So if you haven't had a chance, go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A box. And I will start sharing some of the questions. So one of the questions actually references something that you mentioned early on in the presentation about Remington burning some paintings. There's a question, why did he burn those paintings before his death?
Remington wanted more than anything in the world to be respected as a painter instead of an illustrator. So if we think about Homer, okay, Homer was able to escape the oppressive factory responsibility of illustration work by the mid 1870s because he was selling paintings, and he was Homer became a full member of the National Academy of Design in the 1880s, and Remington never did. So Remington was a workaholic. He was incredibly disciplined, incredibly talented. I think he's the better draftsman of the two. But Remington never became a full-fledged, he was an associate member at the National Academy of Design. The reviewers always, many of them loved his work, but they always saw him in part as an illustrator. And so what Remington burned were a lot of the Western scenes because he wanted to be seen as this. He wanted to be seen as a full-fledged artist like his good friends, the Impressionists, Willard Metcalf and Child Hassam and others, and Homer. And this is the kind of thing he was doing the last 2 years of his life. He wanted to abandon, he had made it as, an upper middle class person. He was highly respected, but he wanted more than anything else to be respected as a painter in the way that people like Homer were.
Another question is, was Homer considered more of a watercolor artist or an oils-based artist?
So watercolor was very much it was a popular medium, but his reputation was completely dependent on his oils. So the watercolors, this watercolor would sell for $50 to $100 in a New York gallery, and he did many of them. He could make easy sales this way. So from one summer, he might produce 20, 30, 40 works in Florida in the winter or in the Adirondacks, from one stint somewhere. But it is the oils that brought him money. So this oil sold for $2,000. And if you think of one oil painting versus the watercolor, this is the kind of thing that would be reviewed in an exhibition in prominent art journals and things in the United States, whereas the watercolors weren't. So watercolor was not, it was considered you know, something worthwhile. John Singer Sargent. So when we think of John Singer Sargent, he had piles and piles in his studio of watercolors. He did hundreds, and he did not exhibit any of them publicly until 1910. And then there were a group of sales in New York, and those sales, that's how the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and the Brooklyn Museum ended up with that great cache of Sargent watercolors because they were for sale. Before that, they were just piling up in his studio. He never would have thought to display them publicly. So it's the oils Sargent would get $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for a portrait of a very wealthy person in London or New York, whereas he's getting very little for the watercolors. So the oils have much more weight in that day than watercolors.
And then we'll wrap up with one last question, which a couple of people have asked. Did Homer and Remington know each other?
No, as far as I know, but did they run into each other? We know that Homer actually borrowed from Remington and respected him as a realist, as someone who got it right. I mean, that he actually inserted in one of his paintings several ducks that were being hunted on the ground from a Remington illustration. But so Homer knew about Remington's work, but as far as I know, I've never seen anything, and I may be completely wrong, but I've never seen anything in the letters or in the books on these artists that they actually met.
Great. Thank you so much, Randall. This was a fantastic presentation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share all your knowledge with us. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us today and participating in our program as well. I wanted to remind you again if you want to see the exhibit that we have on display, looking at both of these artists, Homer and Remington, I encourage you to go onto our website or click that link I put in the chat box to explore the virtual tour of the exhibit while our galleries are temporarily closed. But there's also a wonderful opportunity that will be coming up at the Amon Carter Museum. There is a much larger exhibit that's traveling around the country right now that will be opening at the Amon Carter called Myth Makers, the Art of Winslow, Homer, and Frederic Remington. And that will open up at the Amon Carter on December 22nd and be on display through the end of February. So you'll have a chance to kind of see the work of these two artists in dialogue in person there at the Amon Carter. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I wish you all the best for the rest of your weekend. Thank you.